Hey everyone, I'm rather incoherent, and today, having recently wrapped up my campaign of Feast of Hemlock Vale for the channel, I want to talk about the scenarios in the campaign, what I liked about them, what I didn't like, and how I rank them compared to the rest of all of the scenarios that I played on the channel, which at this point is everything but Circle Undone. Before we get into it, there's some unique stuff involving campaign structure we need to talk about. Let's make a little bit of room first as we discuss this. With a normal campaign, you would see the order for scenarios, ignore the comically bad MS Paint writing. You would see scenarios 1 through 8. That's not how this works. These scenarios can technically be played anywhere 1 through 5, and the last 3 scenarios can only be played as scenarios 2, 4, and 6. This is a 6 scenario campaign, and there is a lot of non-linear choice available. However, it's not quite what this shows, because 1 through 5 is a bit of a lie. As I said, these scenarios over here on the right can only be played for the night scenarios. There's day 1, day 2, day 3, and night 1, night 2, night 3. And these night-only scenarios, including the finale, obviously, but since they can only be played at one point, you miss your chance to play them if you don't. And that's not the reason you have to play them. The reason you have to play them is because they give far more experience than the day scenarios do. And they have very core story moments that are very important to the narrative of the game. And, possibly the most importantly, if you choose not to play them, it fills your bag with awful tokens, and you really, really want to play them. There's no way it's ever better to play something else, with the possible exception of Longest Night, which we'll get into in a second. So even though these are technically 1 to 5, these are really just the day scenarios, and they're 1, 3, and 5, and you end up not playing 2 of them. Additionally, there is the prologues before every scenario. Now, I'm not even going to talk about the first and second evenings. Those actually are just story text. There's not a need for the prologue structure, the prelude structure for those. They're pretty normal story text. You see stuff like them in every campaign. But preludes 1, 3, 5, and 6 all drop down the map of Hemlock Vale. In every prelude scenario, you start with player's doom, and there is no win condition. Your objective is just to do as much as you can. And when you win, when the doom clocks out, that's basically winning. You just proceed to the next bit. There's no penalty. It's not like dooming out's a bad thing. This is just how much time you have. There's no encounter deck. There's no obstacle to overcome. The preludes are just so much story text. You go to the boarding house and you ask about the Vale, Codex 9, and then coming over here. In day 1 in the boarding house, you'll find River Hawthorne there, and then you can talk to River Hawthorne and she'll have a thing. And it'll be like a head test, I believe. And River Hawthorne's gonna increase your relationship with her and give you some story involving River Hawthorne. And the problem is pretty straightforward, right? This is not actually a scenario of Akrham. This is the minimum amount of gameplay you can possibly have. There's very little chance of failure. It's pretty much a guaranteed full clear once you have meta knowledge of where you should and shouldn't be going. And the upside is that this actually does do a good job of making you get to know Hemlock Vale. There are cool things, like realizing that Simeon hangs out of the old mill just because it's where he has his clubhouse. It's finding out that Theo's always around town getting stuff done in different places. It's just even boring stuff oh, Mother Rachel's gonna be at the chapel. That understanding that you develop through gameplay makes her feel more like a real person. And I will say that the preludes succeed at making me more attached to story characters than anything they tried in Edge of the Earth or Scarlet Keys. It is better at doing that. However, as with everything involving story in this game, it's best on its first playthrough. And there's some deeper analysis that will happen on your second and future playthroughs, but I find that after my first playthrough, I'm here for the mechanics. If I just wanted a good Lovecraft story, the source material is still there. There's tons of artists inspired by him to this day, where I can just sit down and read a book, and I don't have to play Arkham to read the story. If I want narrative, Arkham's not where I'm going. If I want gameplay, Arkham is where I go. I'm here for these scenarios, and the preludes are just so much setup and so much time doing something that isn't the reason I'm playing Arkham. This isn't true for a lot of people. A lot of people don't feel this way, but for people like me, I view the preludes as being almost strictly speaking a waste of time. I understand what they went for, but on future playthroughs, to me, it's just wasting my time. And that's not a big deal. I don't really care about that, and in fact, I'm going out of my way to create a system to skip preludes, which is basically just read all the story text, because they're so easy that you can make a real and legitimate argument that you should full clear every time, so you can just read all the codexes and not play the scenario. And I'm not going to get into that now. Tomorrow, there's going to be a video going up with the system I have for why I'm skipping codexes, all the math behind it, everything like that. But for now, just know that preludes exist, and while they're good for delivering a more meaningful attachment to the characters and the narrative, they are not good at gameplay. And gameplay is what I'm in Arkham for. So with that said, with the preludes out of the way, let's discuss the actual scenarios, the thing I am playing this campaign to do, because if I don't like these scenarios, I will simply play other campaigns. That's how campaign choice works for me. And I have a whole video on Red and Rock. Red and Rock is a 2-part scenario where at first you go into the mines, you get to the control room, and then from there you're gonna get into a minecart, ride out through the tunnels in a maze, and it's gonna be a wacky chase scene with lots of ghouls and mole monsters trying to catch you. I have an entire video that's like 10-15 minutes about how I view this scenario as unpolished. And for the record, that's not even a me opinion, that's a developer endorsed fact. They have upcoming errata that they've announced to make the second part of this scenario less random. It's not my wacky opinion where I'm being overly critical that the scenario is unpolished. They're errataing the scenario, they're admitting that it needed more polish. And while the thing they're fixing is my most major criticism of the scenario, I still don't like the scenario. I always rank scenarios based on having the most meta knowledge. So the fact that without meta knowledge, this first act flip is really upsetting. Each investigator loses all but 2 of their clues. There's actually no reason for this text. Usually when you see text like this, you're going into a new agenda, right? You lose your clues and then you advance the agenda to a zero doom agenda, or you go into a completely new map with new mechanics and you've lost all of your clues. But this allows you to keep some of them and you're still on the same doom clock, which is very weird and not the ordinary. And if you got all of the clues on the map, which is randomly generated, so that will always mean different things, wonderful. So if you get all the clues on the map, you'll find that you got 14 clues. And losing all but 2 of them when you only had to spend 2 players, this is a 2-player count example, so 4, you've just wasted 10 clues. And all the stuff you did in the first round of the scenario was a waste of time and it feels terrible. But with meta knowledge, you know that you simply don't get the clues here. And now you've only wasted 6 clues. And if you were actually 2 flex characters and you both had 2 clues, then you only lose 2 clues. And those 2 clues were actually from the one that randomly generated with extra clues. And like, I can work backwards and see how to play it and how to avoid the problem and the meta knowledge issue. And at the end of the day, I'll be like, all right, fine, it's not the biggest deal. I see how to play this correctly with the way the agenda is written, but I personally think the agenda has not the agenda, the act. I think it's an agenda. Like subconsciously it feels that way because it hurts you for no reason. But no, this is an act flip where for no reason you lose different amount of clues depending on who has the clues and what number of clues were on the map, and if you had the gall to do clues at control station before flipping the act, which is wild to me that like this starts with clues instead of gaining clues on the act flip or having refilling clues. Like this just punishes people who gets them. And if it had the text that its clues are refilling, it would actually serve as a hint to like encourage players like, hey, unlimited clues here means that you probably don't need to get them right now. But all of that aside, like it's lack of polish, but meta knowledge, you can figure out that's how it works, and you can start playing it according to it. Where I think the scenario falls apart is in the second half. In the second half of the scenario, right now, this is the thing that there's an announcement somewhere where a developer said they're gonna errata this. The prismatic shard spawns on a randomized location, and the way the rail system works is essentially you can only move the direction the rail on the minecart is facing, so right now I can't go up. There are a ton of mechanics involving moving and sliding locations for clues and resources. I'm not going to dig into it too deep because this video has to be done in a timely fashion. So you would use those mechanics to slide this in front of you and then you go up, and then if you wanted to, whenever you enter a new location, you can turn 90 degrees to the left or right, and during this everyone is just locked into the minecart, by the way. So your goal is to find a route from here to here. You have 2 objectives with Simeon and Prismatic Shard, and Simeon's obviously the more important of the 2, so you can do that and get Simeon. If you don't care about Simeon, which is weird since you came to this scenario and it's Simeon scenario, you can go that way. Or if you're trying to full clear, you can try to work out the route where you get to Simeon and you backtrack and you get to this and you escape, right? And that's obviously like far and away the longest route, twice as long as anything else, way more difficult to full clear. And since it spawns on a randomized location, the thing I just did doesn't work. To get it on this, since you're not allowed to move story locations, or rather assets with story, or rather locations with story assets, to get to this location based on the connections it has, since you can't move it, you have to go down and around like that, and it's nightmarishly long. And they have a router where they're like, this is gonna start off up here or over here. They just said right column on a static location, so it's unclear which. I don't know if they'll put it in the bottom right because that's as far as possible, but in the top right, it's actually pretty easy to get, I think, probably. I don't really know. But like, the fact this is getting errated is the proof in my eyes that the scenario wasn't polished enough, it wasn't playtested enough, it was shipped in a way it shouldn't have been shipped. And the huge issue with this scenario is essentially this text. When the minecart moves, or sorry, forced at the end of the enemy phase, move the minecart once. If it moves off the rail line, each investigator is defeated and suffers 1 physical trauma. So what this says is if your minecart puzzle is not solved, you die. Every turn you have to sort out the next location, and to make sure that you're actually moving the direction you want to go and not about to immediately encounter a problem, you also need to have sorted out what's going to happen in the location after this. So I can't just be like, oh, we're safe, we're good. I have to be at least one solve out, or you've already solved this by sliding it over, right? The minecart demands that you stop playing Akrham on threat of immediate full party kill and solve the minecart puzzle pretty much completely, at least like half the way, before you take your turns. It really hinders the flow of gameplay, and since most of these scenarios have big boss battles in them, and there are so many enemies in this encounter deck that it still qualifies as a big boss battle because of how many enemies are down here, I really don't have like any reason to play this scenario. In terms of picking a scenario, if I wanted to avoid a boss battle, this is not the way to do it. I'd honestly say even a dedicated boss battle like Lost Sister is easier than this, and Hemlock House actually can be played as a non-boss battle. Silent Heath is a pretty small boss battle, but Whispers in the Rock is an encounter deck completely filled with enemies, a puzzle I'm demanded to solve, and normally I would like go into detail and show more of the encounter deck, or at least I think that's what I normally do. But I don't see a reason to do any of that, because Written in Rock is one of the few scenarios that is not just a puzzle scenario, but a puzzle scenario that demands I stop playing the game to solve it in full immediately. And every time the Mythos throws a wrench at me, I have to stop and confirm that the puzzle is still solved on threat of immediate squad wipe, right? Written in Rock is a puzzle scenario that is as intrusive as physically possible. It's a puzzle scenario that is stated by the devs to have not been produced in a fully polished state, that it needs to be fixed. And I have 4 other scenarios I can play. So I'm not gonna go deeper into Written in Rock. I think it's better than Undimensioned Unseen. I think it's better than Kuala Lumpur. Those are some really terrible scenarios, but I don't have to play Written in Rock, ever. Even if I want to play Hemlock Vale, I can just play the other scenarios, so I'm going to. I think Written in Rock is undoubtedly better than scenarios like Boundary Beyond. I'd probably have as much fun playing in Written in Rock as I do playing The Devourer, Below, or Heart of the Elders. It can be a little bit higher on the tier list than this. But unlike those scenarios at the bottom of bad, I don't have to play Written in Rock, and neither do you. And thankfully, that's going to be like far and away the lowest point for this tier list. I actually have, despite like a lot of the impressions I appear to have given, an overall like decent opinion of the campaign. It's not in my top 3, but it's also not even close to my bottom 3. Going next, we have Hemlock House. And I think Hemlock House sort of gets into a problem that I have with the campaign in general, which is that it presents you with this scenario where the house is coming alive and you need to either seal or kill the house. And Hemlock House gets into a little bit of a problem I have with Hemlock Vale in general, which is that for something that presents itself as having so many choices, I feel it often presents the illusion of choice. Like I said, I view this as scenario 2 and this as scenario 4, and I don't think I'm actually allowed to play any other scenario, because if you're gonna tell me I can play these scenarios for less experience at the cost of putting terrible tokens in the bag, then like just force me to play the night scenarios, because I would never voluntarily choose for a strictly worse resolution in pretty much every regard. In the same way, I don't really know that I think Hemlock House is the dual scenario people claim it to be, because here you're presented with this house that comes alive, that's attacking you, and you're given the option of either sealing the rooms and preventing them from coming alive, and then eventually dealing with the heart of the house and like cleansing it, or just burning the whole damn house down and killing the house. And my issue with that is like, let's count up the total amount of house in 2 players, right? This is a 3 plus 4 is 7, and I'll be back with you shortly. So if we add up the Doom, we have 2, 7, and then we lose on turn 8, so only 7 more is 14 turns, right? This house on 2-player has 73 health that we need to deal over 14 turns. And also we have to move around the house, and we're gonna have to deal with a handful of enemies. There's not like a ton of them, but there are enemies in the encounter deck. It's not just the house, right? And I'll admit, this is actually a pretty small enemy deck. Rats are nothing. You don't have to deal with miasmic shadows. It's pretty much just grappling spawns and a few tiny action taxes. And there is stuff that helps you. Set aside, we have in the kill routes. There we go, we have fires, which we can light a fire in a room, walk away, and eventually that room does die. So I'm not saying that like killing the house is impossible, but like, if your team's able to kill the house, how are you able to get enough clues to do any other scenario, right? That's how I feel about it. Killing the house means your Clover has to just be fighting, otherwise they're not really contributing. Like they're gonna get some clues, they're gonna flip a location to get breathing room a bit sometimes. But generally speaking, it's just so much help to kill the house. It's so difficult to kill the house that when the alternative option just like isn't a very hard scenario, like your fighter has very little he needs to deal with until the final boss, Ceiling just seems like the tremendously easier route, to the point where I don't even feel like it's a choice for players like me. Why would I ever try to kill the house? And if I had a team that did kill the house, is that team ever going to be capable of doing pretty much any other objective than kill a boss? So I feel like this is sort of the illusion of choice. Now, again, this doesn't really matter, right? Now, despite the fact that I think the kill route's kind of just like a meme and not a remotely viable option, I do like the ceiling scenario. It's relatively low on fighting compared to the rest of the campaign, which I think is a good thing, that you have an option where a fighter can be like, hey, day one, I'm not that strong, can we take Hemlock House? Or just like a chance to breathe and have a chill scenario for once in this nightmare of a campaign. So, and when I say this nightmare of a campaign, I say that in the best possible way. I think campaigns should be nightmares. I think you should be stressed about what you have to do in the next scenario. And I think that so often I'm playing a Seeker and I just don't care what we're coming up against is like a bad thing. I like that in this campaign, I'm always worried about the next scenario. So I like that this is a relatively low fight scenario when you take the ceiling route. And I think that as a scenario, it like the house coming alive feels like a very well realized mechanic in terms of gameplay telling a story. That's one of the big things I want. A lot of people have this idea of me that I don't care about story at all. Cause like I'll tell you that the preludes are a waste of time. It really sounds like I don't care about story. But what I like from Akrham is when mechanics tell a storyline. I will never forget that room in, where is it, in the Dream Eaters, where there's a staircase, and the picture for the staircase is a wheelchair knocked over at the bottom of the staircase, and it's an action to do a foot test to move for free, and you take a damage when you fail. Or it's something like that. I could be getting the specifics wrong, but I will never forget, like, oh, it's telling the story. You can go down the stairs really fast, but you'll probably hurt yourself because you're being a dumbass. It's the same thing with the balcony in the first scenario of Carcosa, where it tells a story through gameplay. And anytime that they tell more complicated stories, like the house coming alive, feeling well realized, I really enjoy that. So this has the mechanics very functionally telling the story of what the scenario is. There's no need for a big interlude. There's no need for a box of story text. When you play the game, you understand what Living Bedroom is the moment it flips. You don't need an explanation. So in terms of gameplay realizing the story of the scenario, I think Hemlock House is one of the best scenarios at that. But I also think it's like slightly too easy, and being too easy makes the scenario less engaging. Because if I don't have to be trying super hard to deal with the scenario, then I don't have to engage with it to my fullest. It's not as riveting as something that's much more difficult or as something with much more on the line. And as a result, it's like moderately easy, but it's very thematically on point. Where do I end up ranking it? And I'll briefly acknowledge this. When I played this, I think this act flip is absolutely ridiculous. Flip each enemy location to its location side, place one resource as a seal on each unsealed dormant location. That effectively says just get all the victory left on the map. I don't see any reason for this text to exist, and I think it's frankly silly, but with meta knowledge, it has no impact on the quality of the scenario. So how do I rank this? I think it probably ends up very high in my good tier, to be honest. I don't think it breaks into very good, because typically for something to break into very good, I have to view the scenario mechanics as incredibly interesting or the scenario itself as fairly difficult. And I don't view the mechanics of Hemlock House as being anything other than like really good vibes. I think the ambience and the story of Hemlock House is really well done, but I do not think that it is mechanically engaging enough for me to rank it in my A tier. I think I like it more than A Light in the Fog. A Light in the Fog has very similar problems where it's just like not hard enough. It's the scenarios in Innsmouth. This is basically what B tier is, right? It's Innsmouth. It's Light in the Fog, Lair of Dagon, Into the Maelstrom, Horror in High Gear. It's the second half of Innsmouth where the difficulty falls off a cliff because after scenario 4, it just dumps 20 experience into your deck. And it's like, oh, cool, I guess I'll steamroll the rest of the campaign. It's like, that's what makes it a B tier scenario so often, is that it's not hard enough. That's what Hemlock is. If it were harder, Hemlock House would rank much higher. But instead, I'm gonna put it just under Strange Moons because I think Strange Moons is almost engaging enough to make it to A tier. I think Hemlock House is a little bit less engaging. It's narratively better. I'm actually, like, these are very close in my mind. And Strange Moons is from Dark Matter. If anyone's like, what the hell is he talking about? I have Dark Matter in this tier list because I think it's the only custom campaign I've played that is so polished that I don't view it as like unfair to put it against the official campaigns, which I think is the highest form of compliment I can give the campaign. And I do think Hemlock House is like right on par with Strange Moons. Either above or below is fine by me, and right now I'm feeling above. A reminder to anyone who was like watching me like be very upset with Hemlock House at the end of it, I don't think Hemlock House is bad. I think your blind experience can be bad, separate from a scenario being good. And I think that Hemlock House does lack polish. I think that act is like, blind players should never experience the frustration caused by that act flip. But at the same time, I'm not ranking this based on a blind playthrough. And I think with meta knowledge, Hemlock House is much better than the experience that I had. Next up, we have the Silent Heath. This is a scenario I was considering playing, but ultimately chose to play Thing in the Depths instead because Thing in the Depths would have been much funnier, and it definitely was. This is a scenario where I would describe this as like pretty standard Arkham, even though the map's fairly basic. You start off with these 3 locations. Once you get enough clues to advance the act, you spend them, and you get several more locations into play. Specifically, you get these cavern locations, and then a random thing under each location on the map. 50% of these encounter cards will be just that, encounter cards, and the other 50% will be the specific story locations that you're going to need. So this flips, you get Frozen in here. This flips, you get the Salt Chamber, and this is going to have a codex you read that adds something you need to finish the story. This one's going to add one of the crystal remains into encounter cards, and you need to dig through these cards that are underneath your locations with the act abilities by spending clues as lightning bolts. And like, I don't have any strong opinions about this scenario. That's why I didn't play it. Like, I thought back on it and I looked at it and I was like, man, what's my big takeaway from this scenario? What do I really remember from the process of like going around, digging in these locations, looking at the encounter cards? And the big takeaway, the big thing I remembered was being really stressed about specifically the Brood Queen. At the end of every round, this will be on both of the acts, or both the agendas rather, the Brood Queen starts off set aside, and then at the end of the round, or I guess rather the start of the round, when Doom is placed on the agenda, if the Brood Queen enemy is set aside, which she is, you reveal tokens in the Chaos Pack equal to the number of insect enemies in the victory display, and in this case, every enemy in the scenario is a victory enemy, usually victory 0 with the insect trait. If a token with a symbol is revealed, spawn the set aside Brood Queen enemy. And it's not so much that the Brood Queen herself is scary, like honestly, she's not. But the issue is that like sometimes you just have a bunch of insects in the victory display and you can't pull her out, because in the one playthrough I've had of this, that was the issue we had. We had like 4 enemies up here. It's like, we really need her to spawn. We can't like have her spawn with 5 or 6 guys. And we eventually had her with a huge number of dudes, and it was terrifying, and we barely got through. And I don't necessarily think this is a bad mechanic. I think it's the defining mechanic of the scenario, and I think essentially the number of insects you spawn with the queen will be inversely proportional to how long you have to set up for her, and that's generally okay. This is also a situation where the scenario offers really cool counter tech. You know that the queen is showing up, and provided you're not like horrifically unlikely and getting chroma, like you could have a version where chroma blight has gone off and crystal parasites are in the victory display, but that's very unlikely. Much more likely you have a bunch of enemies like this and like that. There's like very tiny guys that you do have to deal with that are going to beat you up, and there won't be aloof because this agenda will remove the aloof tag. But that's great tech for like a reason to run something like Dynamite, something like Storm of Spirits. And I do love good reasons to care about counter tech, and boy howdy is the Brood Queen one of them, so I actually really like that. Even though I don't like that it's out of my control, because it is out of my control. It's likely, but I'm still just rolling dice at the end of the day. So there will be teams where I don't have counter tech, and I can only fight so much, and I set up quickly to do that much fighting, and then the queen just won't show up until they're like 5 guys, and it's a nightmare. And that annoys me, that irks me to some degree, but on the whole, I like the idea of the scenario. But it also strikes me as like relatively standard Arkham. I don't like look at any of the locations here and get like particularly powerful vibes or stories. And on that note, did I get it this time? Yeah, I got the Dry Burrow. I have the feeling that like some of these things are supposed to tell narratives that I don't really get. Like I spoke on Hemlock House, how it was very obvious what story a card tried to tell. I don't understand what story I'm being told on Dry Burrow. Why can I move as a lightning bolt in the Dry Burrow? Why does that? There are so many locations in the game that are like the inside of a house, and I don't get to move for free. Why am I moving quickly through this cave? What makes this cave easy to move through specifically during the day? Because like it's a dark cave, it's in the traits. How is it easy to move through during the day? It's still a dark cave. What are we talking about? Like, why is it scarier at night? It's a dark cave. It doesn't matter what time it is outside. Like if it didn't have the dark trait, if it were implying that light came into the cave, which certainly the art seems to think is the case, but the traits disagree. And this gets into like the whole thing with polish, where I feel like the whole of Hemlock Vale just needed a little bit more time to cook, because I think the dark trait on this was probably added to it after the rest of the card, and it broke the narrative of like, oh, this is a cave with like relatively easy light access from outside, and you're not supposed to be seeing this on other maps than like the ones with tons of caves. And like, yeah, you compare that to the Ashen Slope, that looks a lot harder to walk on. I mean, Pearl Estate Ruins is probably not that bad, but I guess it's implied that we're in the dilapidated house. But there's so many things where like the story doesn't quite jive for me. I don't have a strong like connection to this story. The insects are cool, but like this isn't a story about insects. That's just the theme of that's the monster of the day here, as opposed to a house, as opposed to mine monsters, as opposed to the horseshoe snake, or the thing in the depths, or the bear, or the oh god everything. So I don't really vibe with the story of this scenario. I think there are lots of little things where I have a lot of dissonance with like I think Dry Burrow is like the best example, but everything has this to some minor degree or another. I don't dislike anything about the scenario. It's just fine Akrham. But I don't have anything I really care about in the scenario, something that drives me to want to play it, and it's why in my playthrough I ended up running with Hemlock House, Lost Sister, and Thing in the Depths as my 3 of 5. And I want to be clear, when I say fine Akrham, my C tier for fine is actually like below what I expect out of Akrham, right? The House Always Wins is not a fantastic scenario, The Gathering's not a fantastic scenario, Phantom of Truth is very, very frequently just like the easiest walkover scenario in the game. It's just got no mechanical challenge, or you get horrifically unlucky and it's terrifying. Vanishing Evelina Harper is a fine scenario where your resolution is determined entirely by RNG guesswork outside of your hands. So when I say fine on the tier list, it's not really what I mean when I say fine as a person. I think that this easily gets into the low end of B tier. And I really don't like Heart of Madness Part 2. I think that barely breaks in my B tier. I think Silent Heath is better than that. I will not give it to it over Into the Maelstrom. Into the Maelstrom is always, like, it's crippled by the Innsmouth experience curve. It should be so much more challenging than it is. But Silent Heath is fine. I have no strong criticism of the scenario. It doesn't deserve to be below B tier. But at the same time, there are better and more interesting scenarios I can play in Hemlock, and that's why it's not going to be getting any higher than this. To anyone who's hearing what I just said and thinking like, wow, that was kind of a non sequitur and not a real argument, you're absolutely right. Good catch. I'm looking back on what I just said and being like, huh. But the point I was trying to make is that I don't think it justifies any higher than low B tier, and in Hemlock, with other scenarios that are better being in the same slots, I would probably just prefer to play them, unless I was playing Hemlock twice back to back, and then that would be why I chose to play Silent Heath. Which brings us to our next scenario, the Lost Sister. You'll notice with the Lost Sister that you start with Aquan and play in nothing else, and you have a deck of 12 cavern cards, and you place them down. Normally, with scenarios like this, you do something to rig the bottom of the deck, but as the setup notes tell you here, I'm not going to go in the book because it's just going to be smaller, but there is no setup like that. You just remove 2 of one type of cave and then shuffle them all together, which means that in my campaign, did I get any of it here? Doesn't look like it. But in my playthrough, I used this immediate parlay action to look at the top 3 cards, and I immediately found all 3 of the story locations. And here, I didn't find any of them, which is like what you expect to do. And then you know not to go to those locations. You can leave them undiscovered. But because it's completely random, you can end up just like immediately finding your objectives and having the smallest map of any campaign or any scenario in the campaign, which is weird to me, but I ultimately don't think it really matters. It means that the Doom Clock felt really generous on my playthrough, and it can feel a lot less generous on other playthroughs, but honestly, with like the amount of Doom I had left and how good my RNG was, I feel like the Doom Clock is well balanced for being completely random. Now, the way this scenario works is that every time you get the last clue at a cave location, you're gonna drop the top card adjacent however you want. So probably you just build out a path like this, and eventually if you've gone far enough, you realize like, oh shit, we still haven't found it, and you go out to this direction, you start building back up to save movement actions on the run back, right? I think this is like a really generous way to let you build a map. It's far kinder to you than something like the Catacombs in Carcosa. But it doesn't make it less interesting. I do enjoy like the amount of control I felt like I had when I was moving through the map. And in terms of the locations, I enjoy that there are the dark locations and the light locations, which are really just locations without dark tags. But I enjoy that like the dark locations in this scenario flip the rules for enemies. They use the monsters with night abilities will use their night abilities instead of their day locations at dark locations. I like that mechanic. I do just want to briefly point out how wonderful the art on Suspended Graveyard is. And I like the abilities like Take One Horror, dig between the walls, and figure out a new location without having to get clues or go to a new location. I generally think, and it's also a great way of like burning a wasted scry off of Aquan, right? You just put it down and you never need to go there and you can keep going without moving to a new location. But generally speaking, I have no like super strong opinions about the cards other than they tend to do a good job of telling the narrative. And I really like the mechanic of dark locations using the nighttime effects of the enemies, because so frequently you're only going to show up during day, so you have locations that are dark, locations that aren't dark and are therefore still using the day effects, and you have a bunch of encounter cards that are going to change dark locations to bright locations. Luminous Growth, that's the one I'm thinking of. And you have a bunch of enemies that might initially seem easy to evade, but then you get stuff like not evade, but like literally avoid them. But then you get stuff like Unnatural Growth, which makes them a problem. There's another card, the Mutation, Sudden Mutation, where dealing with them will become an issue because it just spawns another enemy. And also, fantastic art on this. Like, what the hell even nightmare am I looking at? Eventually, you're going to be instructed to drop down Fungal Cave, do your best to surround it with other locations, and once you do that, you're going to be told upon entering, by the way, there is a giant snake The box art is entirely what the scenario is about, and your objective is entirely kill the Limitus hybrid. And this too has the light and dark sides where you can fight different versions of it depending on what your team needs. It's always going to start in a dark location, and the dark location's a bit scary. It's got 5 plus 3 players health, it has retaliate, and it reflects melee damage. So you can absolutely have teams where you want to do something to pull it to a different location. And I forget what location it is. I feel like that's a mechanic somewhere. Is it on the act? Yes. Spend player clues and choose an enemy in a connecting dark location and move it to your location. So you can drag it out with clues into a bright location, which still leaves it with like the threatening amount of health, but now it's elusive instead of retaliate, and it's going to take damage every time you flip it like that, giving your cleavers a way to help fight the boss. And while the meat damage flipping to horror damage doesn't matter, the loss of the reflect damage on melee weapons absolutely does. There are also a couple of locations that can spawn this dude, the crustacean hybrid. He is a hassle to deal with. At 3/3/4, he's hard to trip, at elusive, he's hard to kill, and he only takes 1 damage, which is a hassle that we will get more into later in the campaign, in fact, because this will not be the last time we have to deal with that mechanic. Of course, this is just the day side. If he's at the night side, he's going to flip over, deal damage to everyone, and he's much easier to kill now, but he's still going to be a big dude. He gets plus X health where X is the day number, plus 3, so 4 to 6 is still a big chunky guy, especially with 4 fists once you're able to actually deal multiple damage to him. I personally really like these enemies. These are like up there with Deep Wind Bull for an enemy that like defines how a scenario feels. They're scary in the right ways. There are ways to deal with them. I just really enjoy them. And I think the boss is like the sort of thing a boss for a scenario should be. If you're gonna make a scenario entirely about killing a guy, give me a good chunk of time to fully set up for it, some rough enemies to deal with so that I have something to do when I'm set up, and that also applies to the crystal parasites. And then at the end of it, let me go toe to toe with some massive, ridiculous enemy that's like got good fist numbers, but not something so high where like, you know, like if you have 4 fists, it's a nightmare to deal with. 4 is overcomable by anyone, and if you can't for some reason, you can go through the extra effort to deal with it at 3. I really like everything about this scenario. I have like almost no criticism of it. It tells the story it's meant to tell, that you're looking for a little girl that got lost in these caves. As you dig deeper, you find evidence of where she was and all sorts of terrible things that could have happened to her, until eventually you find her running from this giant monster, and the only way to save her is to deal with the damn thing. I will say this story, once again, lack of polish. I saw this on the subreddit like yesterday, I think. If you get this far in this scenario and then you resign, everyone from this scenario just acts like it doesn't happen. Like, I guess officially this thing eats the little girl, she doesn't escape with you, and then like no one has any response. There's just like not a proper story resolution on a resignation if you get to the final act, which is very weird. And that polish issue notwithstanding, I really, really like this scenario. I think there's enough obstacles, especially with the crustacean hybrids, that I think Lost Sister deserves being very good. There's also a lot of engagement with mechanics because you have like hunter enemies in dark locations that stop hunting in day locations, so it really encourages you to find ways to trap enemies in sunlight. I definitely think it's better than Curtain Call. I think it's a very good scenario. I really like Lost Sister. Pit of Despair is something where I always like, I know Pit of Despair so well. I played it so many times to the point where I'm most engaged with Innsmouth before it gets easy. And it's a good place for me to like compare something to if I can move it higher and very good. Pit of Despair is super engaging because of how difficult the enemies are. There's no way to fully negate them. You have the imminent threat of drowning. You're constantly engaged with the drowning mechanic, making sure you don't drown on a given turn. I think it's not as good as Pit of Despair, but I think it's like neck and neck with it. I think Lost Sister is a very good scenario. I think I'm being way too nice to Tatterdom Alien on the argument of difficulty is engagement. And I think these are both better scenarios than Turn Back Time. They're both better than Dead Heat, even though I think the fight is really interesting. Weaver of the Cosmos has too much RNG. Dark Side of the Moon, yeah, they're just both climbing. It's like, man, I really like Pit of Despair. If Lost Sister's the same scenario, how is it so low if I like it so much? And the answer is I'm being too nice to things above it. Ice and Death Part 3, you just fight, guys. Midnight Mask, it's a very good scenario, but it's just like a stress test for how good you are with degrees of completion. It's not like super engaging inherently. It's engaging because I'm trying to do something that's not intended by full completing. Same with Lost in Time and Space, and Shadow of Earth, again, it's the Innsmouth problem. It's just not hard enough to be as high as it is. I wonder if they get out of A and N to A+ if I like them that much. I'm gonna drop Forbidden Peaks to under Midnight Mask and move both of these up to the bottom of A+. Once I grab the correct cards, of course. I really like Pit of Despair. Also, I can see that this isn't fully capturing my tier list. Let me get this zoomed in, right? There we go. I think on previous scenarios, Silent Heath and Ridden and Rock were far enough over that you saw them. I'm happy with Lost Sister in my A+ tier, and I think Pit of Despair deserved to be that high too. Which brings us to the funniest review, because only technically did I actually play the thing in the depths on this playthrough in the channel. Because like, yeah, technically I played this scenario. Because what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to like go to the top right. Let's draw out how this works. This is North Shore, this is Cranberry Bog, this is starting location. And wow, those are certainly letters, aren't they? Let's try again. Right, so you start down here, your goal is to get up here, do this objective, and then when you get there, it's like, hey, by the way, there's this sick, this is the wrong, that's the wrong scenario. But when you get here, it's like, hey, by the way, there's this sick ass turtle that you need to work with. And I know that might sound like nonsense if you haven't played this before. Also, these are all on the wrong side and should probably spawn on the side you actually see. But there's this turtle here, he's aloof, elusive, patrol, nearest empty location, and your job is to usher him in to the starting location. So you get here, and then you run him back around the other way to the starting location, and you win. And the reason you go the other way is because as you stay on locations, you drop damage tokens, which flip them to from their bog side to their terrible open water side. That just, like, if you come back to them, it sucks. And also, they just have 5 shrouds, so finishing off a victory location like this is gonna be a lot harder once it flips. 4 to 5 is not the biggest deal, but I think there's like some 3 shroud victory locations in here. Maybe not, maybe it's only 4 to 5, but it's still harder to get the clues you need to do things, because on this act you can see you spend clues to push the turtle around. And I really like the loop around the bog, pushing the turtle back to the start. It's a cool route. I don't have a huge criticism of this scenario other than one major player scaling issue, which is like, this force text on the agenda could have stopped without the parentheses. When your turn ends, if you're at a bog location, place 1 damage on your location as a sinkhole. That was good. That was great. You did wonderful. You don't need to keep going. You don't need to say 2 sinkholes instead. There are 1 or 2 investigators in the game, which actually makes sinkholes a much more punishing mechanic at lower player counts. It should be like forced if a location has 3 or more sinkholes on it, remove all sinkholes from it and flip it over. Like if you want player scaling, you can change that location has 3 down to 2 or down to players, so it'd be like less bad on 4 players. Making sinkholes double duty on low player counts means that the cultist no longer helps you because you're dealing with increments of 2 sinkholes, so you go down from 4 to 3 and it still flips. Like, I don't know why negative player scaling and punishing low player counts is a time. Just don't spend dev time doing that. If low player counts get an advantage, let them have it. Don't do this. Let it be. But yeah, I like the idea of like ushering the turtle around. It was like very confusing the first time. I was like, oh wait, yeah, we're a scientist. We came here with Rosa. We're here to study shit. Yeah, we don't want to kill it. Our job is to like research this thing, watch it do its thing, see how it works, and then just leave. We don't need to kill it. And then we find out like actually something is trying to kill it very directly. You've got the thing in the depths, you've got its tendrils which are spawning with the Cheligen hybrid. I prefer the sick ass turtle, the Cheligen hybrid is just a mouthful. And then you find out there's actually 2 objectives, or 2 different resolutions rather. Yeah, you can do the turtle thing, alternatively you can just kill this and study its corpse. And you can't do both at once, which is something I always find sad when there are like 2 different win conditions and I'm perfectly capable of doing both, but I'm told I only get to do one. But that's like a me thing, that's not really important. And I enjoy that you can come into this scenario and you can be like, I'm gonna play it the normal way, I'm gonna run laps around the bog. Or you can do what I did and you can come into the scenario and you're like, yeah, I know there's a turtle up there and Rosa's very interested in that. I'm gonna walk to the middle and kill the thing in the depths. This entire scenario can be rendered down to a single boss fight that happens immediately. And I love that. And as far as bosses go, this guy's scary as hell. He's 4 fists, 10 health, plus 5 players, so 20 and 2 players, 2 foot. He's got all the tags. He's elusive, hunter, massive, and retaliate. And wouldn't you know it, none of those do anything if you trip him. Because the idea behind this boss is that he's meant to be easily tripped. You're not supposed to kill him. You're supposed to deal with him so that he doesn't kill the turtle and barely succeed the other route. But you can absolutely make teams that deal with this guy. Winifred basically soloed the 2 players version of this guy with ease. I've gotten all the encounter cards out, and there's generally not a lot of fighting in this scenario. There's the grasping tendrils, which will need to be dealt with. There's the boss, which will need to be dealt with. There are a couple of acolyte variants. They're nice, I like them. And there's poison blossoms, which like you can kill them, but you're much better off tripping them. And then there's Cochleal Sag. And just real quick, I want to say I like Poison Blossom more than Vengeance. I like an enemy that requires way more resources to kill and doesn't have Hunter as a way to incentivize using foot, then I like Vengeance, which just like hard punishes killing in a way that's far less of a decision. Poison Blossom is actually like judging the resources and coming to different conclusions, and I like that way of incentivizing dodging. I also want to talk about Cochleal Stag, because this is the first set it's shown up in, and it is the Deep 1 bull for this campaign, and I really, really like this enemy's design. 3/5/4 hitting for 2/1 is a menace of an enemy. It's also got elusive, so when you do hit it, since you're not going to kill it, it's just going to walk to an adjacent location and hang out there, which is a huge action tax to hunt it down and kill it. Thankfully, if it's not night, it doesn't have hunter, so when you do this in a day scenario, pretty much no matter where you hit him, you bounce him into a corner, because every location's adjacent to a corner, and you're done with him. But in the night scenarios, if he shows up with hunter, every investigator at its stag's location and each connecting location gets -2 to all skills during the mythos phase. So first of all, like a Deep 1 bull, this guy can just spawn in and immediately do something, where someone draws him and someone else is getting the -2 to their next skill test during that mythos phase. But additionally, at night, he hunts around, and even when he's not at your location because of his elusive trait, he will be chasing you down, penalizing you during the mythos phase. And he's just a really good, iconic, terrifying enemy. I like him a lot. And he's part of the reason that sudden mutation's so terrifying. Do you really want to go kill a mutating Poison Blossom when you could just trip him and leave, knowing that he might turn into a Cochleal Stag? I think sudden mutation's a very, very cool card. I think it really affects like the analysis of, do I kill a Forest Watcher? I know it's got a Doom, but how many actions do I lose to whatever pops out of him? I just really like the encounter set that's at use here. Bloom is really cool synergy with all of these high health enemies that have the Flora tag. It also works on the boss, and thank God they have the text that it only heals 2 players in the boss instead of full healing it, because when I do that, I briefly had a heart attack. But yeah, I really like the encounter set. I feel like the woodland animals that have been corrupted are just like really thematically on point and powerful in interesting ways. Nothing bad to say about the encounter set, nothing bad to say about the scenario. I will say, I think Bog's flipping, like, it doesn't matter as much as you want it to. You just go forward and don't come back. Just like, don't backtrack, that's the solution. And I love that I can come to this scenario, and unlike many scenarios that offer a choice and it feels like a fake choice, I can just fight that guy, right? I don't have to do anything else. I can just say, you know what I want to do? I want to have a 30-minute boss fight for the whole scenario, and that's what I did. It was great. That choice is never offered anywhere else, and it's cool as hell that it actually is a real, meaningful choice here. I will also readily admit that this is less victory than the other solution, and obviously, like, not really worth doing. But once you have 1,000,000 experience on scenario 5, like, you may as well do the more fun route, right? I like that you can kill it. I like the scenario as a whole. I've got very few criticism of it. If I did have a criticism, like, boy howdy, is this a basic map? It's just a 3x3 square. I don't think the bog mechanic is super engaging. Like, it flips. Oh no, don't go back to it. You'll be fine. So coming down to the thing in the depths, where do I think it deserves to be? Let's just move it to the top of good real quick, because I think it is more mechanically engaging than Hemlock House, trying to figure out how to deal with it. I think it easily qualifies for getting into A tier, because the thing in the depths, the Cochleal Stag, sudden mutation, there's enough going on, and even though the bog flipping isn't the biggest deal, it is still something where it's worth thinking about. It's still a mechanic I engage with. I think it's more engaging than Tattered Emolian. I really like that this scenario, more than any other of the day scenarios, realizes the feeling of the corrupted woodlands. Like, Silent Heath sort of gives off the same vibe, but like everything in Silent Heath is dead and alien to begin with. A derelict family manor, insects, things that aren't natural. I feel like the theme of corruption's much better realized in The Thing in the Depths, and I think mutation is a far better way of realizing that than anything shown in Silent Heath. I think having it be right next to Turn Back Time honestly makes a ton of sense, because my memory of Turn Back Time is like you just show up and beat the shit out of Yig, and that's the whole scenario. So having these side by side makes a ton of sense. I think this better realizes its narrative and its gameplay than Turn Back Time does, though. It's close. I think they're both better than Dead Heat Marrakesh, though. I don't think it's better than The Thing in Space. I don't think it's better than Viva Cosmos. I'm happy with having it this high in A tier, to be honest. I think a lot of why this comes up so high on my tier list is the tremendous mechanical engagement of it just having this super important boss fight where certain characters are really good at it and most characters are pretty bad at it. And your team has the decision, like, experience is free enough in Hemlock Vale that you don't have to pursue max victory as every route. You can just be like, hey, are we way better at one of these objectives than the other? Because if so, we should pursue that. And The Thing in the Depths, I think, is the only scenario in the game where I really feel like they've achieved that. Every other scenario has either one objective, or degrees of completion, and not like multiple different objectives where I'm making a meaningful decision based on team capabilities as to which one I go for. And I think that like on that alone, I like it so much that I'm willing to push it up to like at least above Weaver. I fucking love Dark Side of the Moon, it's so cool. I'll give it a few more spots on that decision point, but I can't move it much higher than this, I think. And with that out of the way, it's time to talk about night scenarios, about the Twisted Hollow, and about the Annihilation Bear. Let's start getting this stuff out. And before I get into the scenario, another thing where I want to call out like my perceived lack of polish in the campaign is the Veil Lantern story asset. Regardless of which version you get, it is a hand asset. And in single player true solo, they're like, hey, it doesn't take up a hand slot. And that's nice because in true solo, you don't have a choice. If you build a character reliant on a two-handed asset, you otherwise wouldn't be able to control the Veil Lantern at all while doing the thing your character was built to do. But like, that's not how you address bad player scaling. Because like, in two-player, I had a character that used two one-handed hand assets to fight and clue respectively, and a character that used one two-handed asset. Neither character could take a Veil Lantern and perform their original flex role as intended. Which is like, I know it doesn't affect many teams, but the fact that it does affect them, like, why does it take up a slot? That's my real question. I understand that it looks like it should, but if we're willing to make narrative concessions for the sake of true solo that it just magically doesn't take up a hand slot anymore, then why does it take one up to begin with when, like, that's not the player scaling issue as slots available, right? And this same thing, like, in this scenario, right? Put Dr. Rosa Marquez under the control of an investigator, she does not take up an ally slot. Like, we make the same concession at all player counts immediately after for a less important story asset, so it's just deeply confusing to me. And it feels like something where it's like not the right way to polish the scenario. And the reason I'm willing to harp on that a little bit is because if we set it up for the finale, in the finale you find yourself in this situation, and if you have more players, this piece will be here as well, and your objective is to find the location with the resign action and get out. And yes, you absolutely have abilities to help you do that. On the back of the Veil card, you can spend clues and you can exhaust the Veil Lantern to look at things, and you may mood them if you like what you see, or even if you're just going in that direction in the first place, right? You have tools to help you, but like very obviously your objective is explore a 14 location map, 13 on lower player counts. You're going to have a much harder time with one person or even two people than with four people. The player scaling issue has nothing to do with the Veil Lantern. So why is removing the hand asset the solution we came up with? So I will say that like player scaling in this campaign feels like horrifically mismanaged. Stuff like the Veil Lantern leaves me deeply confused. The preludes that I'm saying don't matter. If you do the math on how many actions you get, true solo gets 14 actions per prelude, whereas every other player count is between 20 and 22. Like you could start with Leo DeLuca in play, and you would only catch up to where other player counts were. So like player scaling is just like all over the shop and deeply confusing in this campaign in ways that I don't really understand. And I need to mention that with Veil Lantern because it's the part where I went from being like, oh, the player scaling is bad to scratching my head and not even understanding why it was bad in the ways that it was. Now, having said that, I fucking love this scenario. Like I have a lot of polish complaints with Hemlock Vale. They really do have issues where like the way things were managed doesn't make sense and doesn't solve problems. I cannot overstate that the confusing polish and Veil Lantern being like a weird hand asset, but only if there's more than one person, it doesn't take away from the fact that I love this scenario. I think that as a scenario, Depths of Yath, the original use of the pursuit mechanic, was far less effective at using pursuit meaningfully than this scenario the Twisted Hollow is. I think that the Twisted Hollow uses the pursuit mechanic far more effectively than it was actually used in Depths of Yath. Like I love Depths of Yath, but not so much because of the pursuit area, because our experience was very frequently that dudes basically just spent all their time in the pursuit area and they came out, you killed them immediately and it wasn't a big deal. Like I don't think the pursuit area in Depths of Yath really made me feel like I was being chased by snakes. This scenario absolutely makes me feel like the woods want me to get the fuck out of the woods. Like I am not welcome here. And a big part of that is the pursuit area is only active very briefly. The scenario is not the gauntlet that Depths of Yath is, where you're adding to pursuit all scenario. At the start, you have this act where things go into the pursuit area, and once you advance it, you get the Annihilation Bear. Like that's just what he is. Playing board games is 100% right. Everyone at my table said this the first time they saw him too. But like, he's terrifying. this dude hits for old one damage, right? He only slaps marginally less hard than Azathoth. That is a 1 horror difference, right? He's enormous. He has 5 fist, 5 health, 3 foot, plus 2 players' health, bringing him to a total of minimum 9. He's also got Hunter and Retaliate with that 5 fist. And also, just like for good measure, if it's Act 2, you know, when he shows up, you're just not allowed to kill him. And if you think you're gonna be clever and put into 1 health before you flip the act, you're gonna get the rug pulled out from under you, because we're gonna heal the bear anyway, and you should have seen it coming. And where sometimes like bad meta knowledge leads you to make bad assumptions and it's your fault, sometimes bad meta knowledge leads you to make assumptions and it's like unclear and like it was a reasonable assumption to make, I think the bear is very definitely not a rug pull, that you're obviously not meant to hurt the bear during this part of the scenario. And that's fine, because the fighter still has a ton to do, right? Like, obviously, if your only way of dealing with this bear is by full killing it to super exhaust it, right? Because there's nothing more exhausted than being in the pursuit area and you pick who comes out of the pursuit area so it's never coming out. Like, full killing it's a terrible solution, but it is a solution. And then if you have a way to dodge it, when you flip this over, you put things in the pursuit area because you were in Act 1. Coming up to the new act, the pursuit area is gone. Everything you stuffed in here is going to slowly filter out for the rest of the scenario. Like when you flip the agenda decks or when you draw encounter cards that reference it. Additionally, because everything's now spawning with you and you just got the bear, you're in a nightmare, terrifying circumstance where the forest feels very hard to deal with. In Act 2, your objective is to get to a specific location, and that location's gonna be towards the bottom of the woods deck. So let's say you get there eventually, you spend your clues, you go to the last part, the bear immediately comes to you and you set up the map that I saw earlier. And then finally, in the last act, you're allowed to kill the damn bear, which is a terrifying boss. You're still probably pulling monsters out of the pursuit area pretty constantly. Everything you spawn is spawning engaged with you, because once again, the pursuit area is long gone. And you have this massive gauntlet to find a way out of the woods and get home, and ideally you manage to kill the bear before you do, but like really you're just trying to survive a lot of the time, especially if you're lower on Doom or your fighter's exhausted its resources. My one criticism of this scenario is how hard this scenario can be if you're not coming equipped to trip a guy. And like, you know what? As the game progresses, being equipped to trip a guy is something that's more and more important to teams, and it's less and less a meme where tripping is just bad, because I think Hemlock Vale did a great job of this, making foot actually matter. Not so much that foot as a stat matters, but that Mythos tests will occasionally test things that aren't head. Sometimes they test fist and book, which is deeply confusing for me and upsets me greatly, but that's actually fine. It's just funny and strange. But foot is the thing where you test Mythos with it. It's more important than it was in Carcosa because of that. Evading enemies has real tangible value, even if you're not doing it with foot, and I like that a lot. And even though the player scaling on this is a bit ass, and it's like true solo, I think you just get killed basically every time, and in multiplayer, above like 3 or 4 players, this is a walkover. It feels like it's a bit RNG to succeed on 2 and very easy to succeed on 3. Like, I still really like it in spite of the bad player scaling. And to quickly show off the enemies that you get in the pursuit area, we've got Poison Blossoms and Black Amasias, which are like really more inconvenient enemies. Honestly, the night version of Black Amasia being massive is easier to deal with pretty much across the board, because aloof requires an action to engage and you just beat up the guy. Like, he's massive, but he's a 2/2 enemy, who even cares? Corpse Lycan's still just genuinely a scary card, 4/4/3 Hunter at night, and Alert is like not really a problem, but he's just a beefy dude that can be hard to deal with. Cochleal Stag is back, and he's a hunter this time in a scenario where you're already busy fighting or running from bear, so he's a menace. Forest Watchers can be very hard to find time to deal with because you're busy trying to find your objectives. And Stalking Hybrid is a 3x3 that can scale up to 3/5/3 right before the scenario ends. And the fact that he's so menacing, being so chonky towards the end of the scenario, doesn't really matter, because Prey Investigator with the Veil Lantern only can get you some pretty cool plays to get around these guys, which was actually shown off in my run, where like, who has the Veil Lantern impacted what was required to deal with this, and I like that that's a thing. I mean, in truly desperate times, you could voluntarily rip the Veil Lantern out of your hand so that he would stop engaging you. I don't think that works retroactively, but you could find yourself in a situation where you like play Thieves Kit just to discard Veil Lantern because you know you can't deal with Stalking Hybrids anymore and you'd rather they just leave your party alone, and that's cool as hell. And like realistically, that only comes up if like you found the final scenario location, right? You found the resign. You're like, thank God we're out of here. We don't need the Veil Lantern anymore. I'd rather be in the dark and not have to worry about Stalking Hybrids. But even that decision point existing is cool. So I'm a little bit torn on where it goes on the tier list. I think it's going to end up on the border between good and very good somewhere. Because as much as I like the bear and I like dealing with the bear and I like the way the pursuit area is used, I really dislike bad player scaling. I dislike things where mechanically it feels like a scenario is missing the mark. And the player scaling, especially when you're like it's just action tax, right? You just have to see all the locations. That feels pretty rough in true solo and 2-player. I'm gonna see where I'd rank it if I didn't think it had bad player scaling. Does it just go like straight to A+? The pursuit area is definitely a menace, but it's not like super engaging. It's just a thing that's happening to you and you have to keep yourself aware of what your options are in the pursuit area. The bear is terrifying. You're always engaged with the bear. The same is true with Coquille Stag because it's a night scenario. You are just walking around looking for stuff, but you always know where in the deck the stuff you're looking for is, which makes it a lot easier to deal with it being random because you can do, like in my scenario, I had a point where I just ran 3 locations. So I knew that the top 6 locations didn't matter to me. So I was just milling them out of the deck to start finding stuff I actually needed. I think there's a lot going on and it's all engaging, and the bear and stag are so scary that you actually do engage with every mechanic, even the ones that aren't initially super hard, because you need every edge you can get against the terrifying enemies that are active in this map. So I do think it's a really, really engaging scenario. I think it's better than Pit of Despair if I ignore the player scaling. Think it's better than Shattered Aeons? Maybe. I don't think it's better than Double Reef. But then we get into player scaling. I play probably more two-handed Arkham than I do with my tabletop crew. The fact that it's kind of feeling pretty random how that scenario resolves is a big blow to it. I'm gonna drop it to the very top of my A tier. If it weren't for bad player scaling leaving a sour taste in my mouth, I would actually put it in my A+, and I'd probably put it right under Double Reef. But the bad player scaling, because it's like you get to the final act and it's just like, hey, reveal 13 locations, less if you're lucky. And when you only have 2 people, that's a lot scarier. When you only have 1, just kill yourself now, right? If it weren't for bad player scaling, if instead of like giving you a free hand asset in true solo, they actually gave you something useful in true solo and maybe even in 2 players, or just slightly lowered the count of random locations. With another polish pass, like this problem goes away, it gets to live next to Double Reef. And holy shit, I love Double Reef, one of my favorite scenarios in the game. Like the fact that it's not good enough to actually be an S tier speaks volumes of how many incredible scenarios there are. And Twisted Hollow has some real mechanical problems with player scaling that's going to hold it down even lower. Which brings us to The Longest Night. And this is easily my favorite scenario in the campaign, and I understand if a lot of people like rather strongly disagree with that. Let's briefly set up the map, how it will likely be when you play the scenario. In some ways, The Longest Night is similar to the finale for Circle Undone, Before the Black Throne, where it's so hard, and frankly so much harder than the rest of the campaign, that planning around this scenario is what it means to plan for the campaign. And that's because every turn you're getting an encounter card and an enemy card. The enemies will never be spawning with you unless you're in the outer fields. Instead, they'll spawn at either the north, west, south, or east outer fields, and your job is to play tower defense. You have the scenario card where you spend clues for barriers, decoys, and traps. Barriers stop movement, decoys super evade and deal 1 damage, traps just deal 2 damage. And you have certain enemy types that are going to be spawning. You have slithering hybrids who are aloof and relatively shit little enemies that aren't very hard to deal with, but they ignore everything. You have equine hybrids who again are like pretty trashy enemies, but they have 3 health and they only take 1 health at a time, and they ignore traps. Then you have molting hybrids who are the parallel to that for barriers, where they are aloof, so they're a nightmare to get to. They're taking 1 damage at a time. They're ignoring barriers. So these guys like are a lot of actions to chew through, the equine hybrids and the molting hybrids. But there's also plenty of real enemies that you just need to get through the hard way. Capra hybrids are 5 health menaces. They hit for 1-2, and basically every fighter is more scared of horror than physical. And all of these enemies have patrol go to the farmhouse, which is where the captives are, and your objective is to make sure they live. If they die, you get the bad resolution. And your entire objective is just survive for 10 turns. There will be cards that add doom to other cards, counting against your doom clock. There will be cards that reduce your doom. So it's likely you'll survive for more than 10 turns on a full clear. And you want to keep them at 0 damage taken to full 10, but that's very, very hard to do and to some degree RNG reliant. But thankfully, one of the outer fields, I forget which one exactly, let's just flip everything over. It's this outer field here. You get to heal 2 damage from your captives once per round, which is essentially you get to soak 1 hit on them and you can still find a way to fix it. Frankly, I dislike there's a randomly removed outer fields because it means you might randomly remove the one that gives you that room for error. I don't think that's a good thing, but all in all, relatively minor issue, not a huge deal. And there's one type of enemy I haven't covered yet, which is the Lupine Hybrid, who has the elite tag, and that's also something I would call a foolish mistake, because considering everyone else ignores something and Capras are objectively more difficult to kill, there's no reason this man should be elite. He's just a guy. He's still a 4 health guy that's pretty hard to deal with, but he's just a guy. Retaliate with 3 fists does not deserve an elite tag when you've got Capras and multiple enemies that take 3 hits to kill. Like, I don't know why he's an elite, he shouldn't be. But you have these 5 types of enemies spawning at these 4 locations. Capras spawn at the lowest number of enemy locations for an outer field, and Slithering Hybrids will stack on to the highest. And if you like break it down to the nuts and bolts and really try to analyze it, I come to the conclusion that, like, holy shit, this is really well-designed tower defense. It's really hard too, like incredibly hard. Invariably, what you'll want to do is start at outer fields and backpedal, dropping traps and decoys. It's easier to defend while falling back, and it's almost impossible to defend while pushing forward. Additionally, if you aren't at 4 players, you'll pretty much always just want to drop double barrier trap decoy, well, player counts barriers trap decoy, at whatever location you're not putting someone at. And in terms of dealing with the bear, that's gonna be pretty RNG reliant. Your best bet is to have the bear ready, then hunt into you into a trap and decoy, flip, and you beat him to death then. But that's not something you're guaranteed to be able to safely do. You could immediately pull enemies you have to deal with on turn 1. It's unlikely you'll get anything too bad since you'll be able to put Capra somewhere else most of the time. But like, it's not guaranteed that you're gonna have an easy time dealing with the bear just because you know the strat to start in an outer field it'll hunt to, because the bear actually is able to move to all outer fields as though they were connected. Like, it's not guaranteed to deal with the bear, but there's a very good strat for dealing with the bear. Just generally starting in outer fields and falling back is a very good plan, and it worked out really well when I was doing it. And every time I've played this scenario, I've had the following impression, which is why I like the scenario so much. When I played it on camera, I was like, if Winifred weren't here, we would just be dead. Winifred's like popping off, playing ace in the hole every other turn, teleporting across the map with Ajax and a 3-move nimble, and just like doing so much work. She's using sleight of hand and firing off every bullet in her British Bulldogs, then doing it again next turn like she has unlimited ammo for all these really high value fight attempts on these enemies that can only take 1 damage at a time, so you need unlimited resources. What would I do without Winifred? But the first time I played this, I was saying the same thing about Alessandro with Power Word, holding 3 of the enemies down and then using them to kill the enemies that can only take 1 damage at a time. I was saying the same thing in our second playthrough about how, like, thank God our Kluber's a Seeker, specifically Kate, with a Ravenous Myconid, and she's just eating the guys that can't take more than 1 damage at a time. Every time I played this scenario, I was like, thank God for this one uniquely powerful thing our team can do that's really good in this scenario. And I think that's the mark of a scenario that's like directly hitting the highest level of difficulty that you're allowed to hit without becoming like brutally unfair. The fact that I've consistently felt that I needed this strong broken thing on my team to get through this scenario is why I like it so much. And I believe that you should be counterattacking the hardest scenario in a campaign, which is definitely this one. So like, if you come here with the flamethrower, you're like, oh God, I can't deal with Equine Hybrid. There's like enemies in 3 different locations that will never be together. Flamethrower's just hitting for 4 against guys that only take 1. I can't believe this has happened to me. Like, yeah, a blind experience, that fucking sucks. I had a terrible experience my first time. I was terrified out of my mind. And like, I was at Alessandra, I was having a good time, but I was still like curiously having a bad time watching whoever our fighter was do fucking nothing. So this is absolutely right for having a bad experience in a blind playthrough. But I think on subsequent playthroughs, when you like plan around this, and my plan going in was like, Winnie has ace in the hole and I'm told she'll play it a lot. She should have unlimited ammo with sleight of hand, or I'll get a switchblade. Either way, it's not gonna run out of bullets. And it worked. Like, I counterattacked with Winnie, that was my plan coming in, and it worked. And I thought Vince would be better than he was, but like, hilariously, this is the one scenario where he really got to like carry his weight and show off what the deck was capable of doing. I really like this. I think the barriers are a lot of mental load. I think this scenario is like one of the most likely for it to be a shit show in your blind playthrough where everyone has a bad time. Like, in the entire roster of Arkham scenarios, I think the Last Night's one of the easiest to have a terrible time your first playthrough with. But that said, I also really think that like, once you understand the mechanics, you know who skips which mechanics, you understand they're spawning equally, who spawns in empty areas, who spawns in big areas, you understand like the general tower defense play pattern that is going to be efficient, you have a plan for dealing with the bear, you understand that these enemies exist, that there are a ton of aloof enemies here, and that counterattacking this stuff is going to matter a lot. I think when you approach it, like you look at playing Hemlock Vale and you start thinking about Longest Night immediately, this is one of my favorite scenarios in the entire game, and it's not even close. I've said a lot that being difficult is engaging. When I talk about scenarios getting into A tier were very good, the thing that tends to hold a lot of them down in B tier, the entire second half of Innsmouth, is that they aren't engaging because they aren't hard. No matter how interesting or complicated a system you build, if I can just dig in the bag with deduction and steamroll your scenario, I don't give a shit, right? That's very frequently what holds a scenario down into B tier, as if it's just not hard enough to force me to engage with its mechanics. You cannot avoid engaging with Longest Night's mechanics. It is a foregone conclusion that I put this in my S tier for favorites, because I love how difficult it is. I love how rewarding engaging with its mechanics properly is. I love that the difference in playing it blind and then tearing it down, rebuilding the scenario from the ground up and understanding how it works is a tremendous increase in player efficacy, because like almost no scenario do you actually get a much better playthrough of the scenario from digging into its nuts and bolts. Longest Nights is one of the only scenarios where understanding the scenario in full really helps you to get better results when playing the scenario. So like, how high does this get to go on the tier list is the question, because I've been talking it up a lot. My only criticism so far has been, I don't like that an Outer Fields location removes randomly when Outer Fields locations are the ones that matter. Let's go back a second. I have another criticism. There are multiple locations, where are they? That have text like this: draw one set aside fire treachery, shuffle another into the encounter deck, limit once per round. The idea here is that a team that's like really struggling to deal with equine hybrids can light this on fire to deal damage to those enemies. And I guess I need to show off what fire is. Fire is this card. It attaches to the nearest location, so the one you're at, with no copy of fire attached. And then test 4 foot to put it out, but we don't want to do that. We're starting these fires ourselves. And then at the end of the round, each card with health at this location takes 1 direct damage. But like, that's not dealing with the equine hybrid, right? Like if you were to light this location on fire, because remember, these inner locations are all randomized. If they hunt into the captives, they're gonna hit the captives. This isn't gonna kill the enemy. And if you're in the outer fields, they're not gonna get past you to the fire. So like, is the plan that you're gonna walk out to the fire like that and fight them in the fire and take the damage yourself? You can't put more than 1 copy of fire on a location, so that's a useless foregone conclusion. I feel like there's argument, specifically like where the coop generated this time, that you can light the coop on fire and then hold the line at barn. But you don't really want to do that. You want to deal with them as early as you can, because there are cards like Incursion, and I think there's even a token, right? Yeah, on a tablet cascade, you can have enemies ready and move. So if you're letting them get to the inner locations, then you can just have them immediately jump the gap and hit the captives. It's actually scary as shit if they're not dealt with immediately, which, like, spoilers, they will never be dealt with immediately. It's a terrifying scenario. So making a plan to take the one area where you have reaction time and give up the reaction time and force yourself to delay till here, that hurts a lot. I think this whole fire thing is bait and a trap, and I've never even like had a situation where the farmhouse caught on fire because you put one in the deck. You can have it drawn somewhere else that is detrimental. You can be holding out in a field, the field catches on fire, and now you're forced, because you have like 5 turns left, you can't just stay in the field and fight anymore. You gotta bail. I think fire is a trap, and I think it's like meant to be a way for teams that are in that blind playthrough experience to like counter equine hybrid. And holy shit, it is not a counter equine hybrid. One, if you light a fire here, equine hybrid is 3 times more likely to spawn in a different part of the map than the one you just cut off. 2, it deals 1/3 of equine hybrid's damage to you, and this is a scenario where your health is a resource and you will need to take the health damage. These cards are clearly meant to be a solution to equine hybrid and molting hybrid, and they're just fucking not. And like, honestly, that's part of why I like the scenario, is that fire is useless and it's not making the scenario easier, but it clearly was meant to. Like, I think that if Hemlock Vale got the additional polish passes that it needed, these coop locations would be something else. Maybe there'd be like a kindling token mechanic, and like the coop started with kindling, and you were able to get Molotovs at the farmhouse that you were able to use on adjacent locations that dealt increments of 1 damage increased by kindling tokens that they consume when used. Like, maybe that would be like a lightning bolt mechanic where you spend an action to pick it up, and that's how the mechanic would work to help deal with these enemies. I don't know. But like, the way it works now, this is a trap. It acts like it's going to help, and it clearly just mechanically doesn't do enough to help you with the problem. But as I've just said, I don't even care, because the fact it's not helping makes the scenario more engaging. Like, it's obviously a mechanical flaw in my eyes, but I don't care because the mechanical flaw is making me have more fun. So just immediately I'm putting it above the Pallid Mask, and we can see how high it climbs from there. I will mention that Starfall is the exact opposite of Longest Night for why it's in my favorites. It is not a super difficult, mechanically engaging scenario where I'm forced to like make painful decisions and scrape by every turn and I'm living on the edge of the knife. Starfall is here because it's doing such a wonderful job of having its mechanics tell the narrative of living in a space opera so well. It is so incredibly well realized. It explores the ideas you can do with the scanning deck so incredibly well. Longest Night's like on the opposite end of the spectrum for why I like scenarios, because it is such a mechanical challenge and to really sink your teeth into. But also, that mechanical challenge is the narrative of the story, right? The Longest Night is the longest night because you only have to survive 10 turns. It's a short scenario, but they're some of the most dense, difficult 10 turns you will ever play. Everything that feels like a really difficult, nightmarishly hard challenge, that's the point of the scenario. The narrative is like, holy shit, these monsters are endless and they're going to kill us all and we can't possibly solve this. And I think that might just bring it straight to the fucking top, because the thing that I love about it, the thing that I want every scenario to do, is the narrative of Longest Night. I think it easily beats Depths of Yath to me. Depths of Yath is a similar idea, but the pursuit area is not well realized enough. If I felt like Pursuit was done as well as Twisted Hollow was in Depths of Yath, I think it might be getting blocked down on third place. Or maybe they'd both be above Where the Gods Dwell. Where the Gods Dwell is an incredibly fun scenario, very unique, very difficult. Lots of cool counter tech can be shown off in that scenario. I think of what I've played so far, Longest Night is my favorite scenario. And I'm not 100% sure if I can say Return to Before the Black Throne is my favorite scenario still. I really like Longest Night now that I've got a chance to really sink my teeth into it. I love that scenario to death. Which brings us to Fate of the Veil, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be nearly so positive about this one. I'm going to start off with some things that just rub me the wrong way. If you look at Cosmic Emissary for more than 15 seconds at a time, you're driven insane. You're not Carcosa, you're not cool, do your own thing. That's how I feel about that. Where this is like, this has the same vibes as Nyarlathotep being in your hand, not being able to be talked about, not being able to say Hastur's name. But this came out of nowhere. This is like a funny rule they threw on the front of a card, and like, I don't feel like it has anything to do with anything we've ever discussed in the game. Looking at the Cosmic Emissary being bad for you, if you want to explain that mechanically, don't do this thing where like, obviously we're never going to do it if we remember it, so it will only ever be something that retroactively just instantly kills someone and ruins the scenario, right? Like, this is just bad. There's no like storyline to this. It's just silly and goofy. And like, saying it's bad is maybe overly harsh. It is just silly and goofy, but it has no reason to be there. And I have no tolerance for extra text when we have the Abyss deck here and we have plenty of fucking mental load to worry about without this nonsense. So when I was initially recording this, I realized I made some rules mistakes and immediately got distracted from my point. But part of the reason that this rubs me the wrong way so much is that it feels like it's doing something where it's like fan servicey. It's referencing like, hey, wasn't it cool when you couldn't say Hastur? Wasn't it cool when you couldn't talk about Nyarlathotep? And a big part of the reason it comes off that way is because like, this is very clearly the spider boss, but like the spider boss rotated and had mechanics, and once you ripped off its legs, it became a different boss that was like really super distinct. And with this, like when it becomes a different boss, we're just on a different map entirely. We're not exploring the same map. It doesn't feel like an evolution of the same concept. This thing never rotates. It never does anything. There's no difference in it being arranged like this, or it just like they're at the locations and you're on a square, right? Like, as much as I hate to say it, get all this stuff out. As you can see, I've loaded a previous save. Like, if you just made a square map and it was connected like that, and they were just at the locations, it would be exactly the same. It would be mechanically indistinguishable from how it currently functions. And it's just a fan service thing. Like, hey, wasn't the spider boss cool in Dream Eaters? And like, yeah, it was, but I'm busy with the Abyss deck. I've got a lot of other shit to worry about. And I really wish like these random fan servicey things weren't happening on top of what I feel is a generally unpolished, unfun mess, just adding to the jank and the clunk and getting in the way. Like, fan service wouldn't rub me wrong if it were in a scenario that I liked, but there is a rather glaring issue that I'm sure my past self will cover shortly. I'm discovering that I forgot to flip these guys to the correct version when I did my finale. Grumble, grumble. The funny thing is though, these enemies are aloof, and I was running around constantly during the finale, and frankly, the original forms were more inconvenient because I was only there for like 3 turns. And I'd rather just have like a penalty token where I get hit for damage that I'm able to soak. Let's immediately go talk about the Abyss deck, since it is so much of the mental load of this scenario, at least on a blind playthrough. On future playthroughs, you pretty much just know how the Abyss deck works, and it's only when you draw something weird that you're going to need to mess with this. But on your playthrough, you're going to take all of your Investigator cards and the top 5 of every Investigator's deck, and you're going to shuffle them in to the top 14 of the Abyss. You know, if they're willing to play nice. There we go. You shuffle them in, you put them on top, and then people draw from the bottom of the Abyss deck. And your goal to get these back is to use the reaction on the act, where after a skill test at a layer location during your turn, reveal cards from the bottom of the Abyss for each point you succeed by, draw one of them, shuffle the rest, and place them on top of the Abyss. So you know the bottom 14 of the Abyss aren't going to be relevant, and you just want to dig through the first 14 just about as fast as you can. And then once you're done with them, well, of course, they're going to be shuffled and placed back on top of the Abyss. You're never really getting rid of them. But then you're in a situation where you have to like just play the odds and hope it works. Let's say you have 3 tests during your turn and you can probably pass by 5 on each of them, and you do just that, right? No Investigator card. Second test, you get an Investigator card, you're lucky, you're good. Roland Banks comes back, you get this guy flipped over, you take control of him because that's what it says here. And when you flip this over, it gives you the ability to spend clues to find another one. But there are other situations that can occur. And so this last player card, you could have gotten Zoe as well. And if that were to happen to you, which is actually more likely at higher player counts, I think, statistically, I'm not 100% sure, but if this were to happen to you, you would get Roland, and Zoe would go back on top, because the timing window when a card is revealed has already passed, and this one just goes on top. Another thing that can happen to you is you just get unlucky, right? You put down this card, you just get unlucky, right? You keep going, you put down all of these, and despite digging 15 plus 14, 29 cards immediately, you don't find what you're looking for. Roland and Zoe are still in the bottom of that deck. It all shuffles, it goes back on top, Mythos phase comes around, and up, you don't draw that, you don't draw that, you don't draw that. There you go, there's your encounter card. We'll just be putting these Investigators back on the top. And I need to show off those 2 RNG things that can happen, because they're not hard to happen. Or at least I assume they aren't, because I saw both of them in my first run through the game at 3 players. And I cannot tell you how frustrating it is to commit your entire turn after reading this, let's get these flipped correctly, reading all of these, figuring out which of the 4 slight different mirror nest locations I need to be at and what the penalties for being there will be, learning my new Investigator, figuring out how my hand copes with what I'm currently being forced to play as. We figure it out, we dig through over half the deck, and then all of our Investigators go right back on top at the end of the phase during the encounter phase. That happened to us. Not all of them, like 1 or 2. But I cannot tell you how deeply frustrating that is to experience. Additionally, maybe perhaps the bigger problem than just like bad RNG variants being really unfun, because thanks to the alternate side of this, like you will invariably eventually get your guys. Instead of taking 2 rounds, it might take 4 or 5, and that sucks, but because you're going to full heal when you switch off of this, it's not gonna be the biggest deal in the world, most likely. What I find much more annoying is that for the first potentially several rounds, because in our next act, once we all get our true selves back, we're going to shuffle in a bunch of caves. And these caves just straight up shuffle in. There's no like rhyme or reason, they're just in the deck. Well, that's the right way around, so it actually shuffles. They're just in the deck, randomly dispersed, and you have to find them to do the next objective, which is clear 3 caves, which, by the way, this should very obviously be players' caves. Why is that not a scaled value when going to new locations is the chief example of negative player scaling impacts, right? That's why Explore and huge maps hurt so much more in true solo, and even a little bit more in two-handed. Why this is not players' caves is beyond me. But until you're done with this, which is a pretty substantial amount of time to get your Investigators back and reveal all the cave locations, all of your turns, you're like, all right, we do the Abyss, we pass by 3. Okay, I take the cave, we do the Abyss, we pass by 4. Oh, thank God, I take the cave. All of this stuff is shuffling and going back on top. And right now I'm doing it impossibly fast because you have to resolve your tests. And oh no, there's a cave, but also Roland. I guess we'll take Roland. There are so many decision points happening with the Abyss, which is normally something I like, but it's just so much mental load, so much math to do it optimally. And the worst part is that it's not fun. It's a thing tacked on to every action you're doing that grinds the game to a bloody halt, it feels like. In the same way where I don't want to deal with the minecarts, because the minecarts say, if you don't do us, you're going to die, so you have to solve us before you do anything. Anytime I do anything in this scenario, I've got to deal with the Abyss deck. I've got to figure out the optimal play for like how many cards do I want to aim to mill first, and I aim to mill 5, but oh, you got a -3? All right, we'll just mill those 2, and then I obviously will give the player card to whoever was running Breach the door, right? That's the issue, is that every action, you do the math based on the absolutely brutal chaos bag that doesn't exist right now, but trust me, it's not a fun time. Then you figure out what your result is, then you do the reveal, then you make the decision. And adding those 4 steps to every skill test just makes the game a fucking exhausting grind. It's not just the turns are longer, it's the turns are mentally exhausting. Additionally, I want to point out that Cosmic Emissaries are just like comically not threatening in this first part. This is basically the edge of the earth problem where like your fighter just trips a guy or punches a guy for any amount of damage and the emissary just doesn't exist anymore, which is, you know, not particularly interesting. And then in the second part, when they flip, they are admittedly much scarier. 10 health is a ton on all of these. Getting through them is not easy. And because they don't care if they're ready or not, despite being aloof, you can't even trip them to briefly turn them off. They all have hunters, so they're all trying to follow you. And realistically, depending on the scenario version you get, it's gonna be very different. I don't remember the version with Rosa Marquez very clearly. I only remember the one that I just played. And funnily enough, because there's so much mental load, even on the second playthrough, I fucked up. And part of the reason I fucked up is polish issues. Coming over to the act, once you get all those cave locations, everyone loses their clues, check the campaign log, and proceed to scenario interlude, Fate of the Vale, page 64. I'm already off the card. That's correct. That's what you do. When you're told to go to a scenario interlude, you don't read further. You go to scenario interlude. That's how it works. Fate of the Vale number 1. Okay, let's start reading. Because I wasn't told to do anything else, I just start reading. Only this is wrong, isn't it? Because this is supposed to say the investigators must decide their course of action, choose 1, and then proceed to Fate of the Vale 1 on page 64 scenario interlude is how it should be phrased. It shouldn't tell me to go to the interlude before it tells me which version of the interlude to go to, because in every other card in the game like this, you resolve the interlude first and then you continue reading. And if I weren't mentally exhausted, maybe I wouldn't have set up the version for Rosa Marquez and then realized, like, wait, this is wrong. I'm supposed to be saving the Vale, come back, reread this, and realized it was ordered wrong. And then set up Fate of the Vale. So other versions of this finale, I've never played Simeon's, and I don't recall the one with Dr. Rosa very much. Is that even her name? Is it Rosa Marquez? Well, it's definitely something Marquez. But I don't remember version 1, I've never seen version 3, so we'll be talking about version 2. The hilariously scuffed version 2, because I won't be replaying it, where because I was so exhausted after dealing with the Abyss for like nearly 2 hours, having done a prelude before it, having had to deal with going around getting the caves, just the amount of nonsense setup by the time I'm done with setting this up, I didn't realize that I had just like put them down like this, apparently. I think what had happened is in my head, I'd already flipped them, but I just rewound time and didn't even think about reflipping them. And by the time I'd set this up, I was just like, you know what, I'm done. I'm gonna go to bed. I didn't think I'd still be playing or be this tired at this point. And I played the rest of this several days later. I was like, oh yeah, they're just chumps, I guess, like Edge of the Earth. Because I didn't realize that like they still have the Abyss tag. I was like, oh, I wonder what a Shattered enemy is at some point. Oh well, maybe it's like the Miasma Ghost. No, it's fucking these guys. I'm an idiot. And while I take full fault for that, I will also say that like idiots make less mistakes when there is less mental load in the game. The more mental load, the more people make more mistakes. That's just how it works. I will also say that realistically, I probably just like solved the scenario even easier because I was playing it like it was Edge of the Earth and I had to come over to this guy and smack him to have him not hit me. But if they're just hunters, it's easy to gather them all up and then just ditch them and run them around. Like, yeah, there'll be a problem in the crossroads. I was on this map for like 3 turns. I honestly think if they were elusive and able to be manipulated with Hunter, I'd have had an easier time dealing with them. There'd be like the one scary Mythos phase where I have a very good chance of taking a good chunk of damage from one of these effects. But like, honestly, I don't look at this and think that I played the hardest version of the scenario. Or rather, I don't think I made the scenario easier. I don't think this is a harder version of the scenario. I think having to deal with them was actually more inconvenient than having the aloof guys that I could easily bait into the wrong locations. Because like what you'd want to do is you would bait them up to Tad's General Store. This comes up, this comes up, this comes down. You don't want to be in the crossroads right now, obviously, but then you go down, they all collapse over here, and you run them into the corner the next turn, taking them down here, while you waste your whole turn dealing with the Gideon I had here, but like it doesn't matter. You've got them boxed, you just never go to the crossroads the turn they're at the crossroads now, and it's problem solved. Like, this is an incredibly easy to solve enemy, just like the other side's an incredibly easy to solve enemy. So I completely mucked up the scenario, but at the same time, I don't think it actually made the scenario harder looking at it now. Obviously, running through here would be a problem normally, but I was just like finding ways to get evades on Winifred anyway. So I'd be happy to start with Winifred, walk here, and trip this person into the ground every single turn. Also, well, I think this text, if you look at Cosmic Emissary for more than 15 seconds at a time, you're driven insane. It's like unnecessary and burdensome and shouldn't be there. I think forced when this enemy is defeated, each investigator takes 100 head. Everyone who fails is devoured, they are killed. I think that's actually really good. One, you need a forced effect to say you're not allowed to kill this enemy. They are staying here, you cannot kill them. That's actually an important game mechanic where having the forced text there is good. And two, this is a funny way to communicate you will die, you are not allowed to do this. It wastes like a couple of extra words instead of an entire line on the agenda when I'm like, in my playthrough, I'm sure it's edited out, you don't see me doing it, I don't even know where the Abyss rules have gotten to. I'm like, wait, why do I get this? I know that when I draw myself, I move this over and I get it and I'm back to being myself. Is it on the agenda? Is it on the act? I'm like in the rules flipping through. No, it's in the top of the Abyss deck. It's this rules card that I had just forgotten was there. So like when I'm flipping through the book trying to find rules and I found this, it's just like not helpful. It shouldn't be there. It's burdensome. And as for like how hard do I think this scenario is, I don't know. It's like Congress of the Keys in that way. Because this scenario can have wildly different degrees of difficulty. You can have Mother Rachel dead, Gideon's alive, Rose is not a resident, Leia can be dead, Bernie can be on your side and is not a resident, Theo's on your side, Judith can't be, Will can be on your side, Helen can be on your side, Simeon can be dead. So you can have a result, like I did, where there are 2 living people who can spawn, and it'll also give you 2 revelers. I believe it's in one of these sets. So with my story resolution, there are 4 people in this 8 location map, and you could have had up to 8 people spawning here that you need to deal with, let's find the agenda I'm supposed to be on actually. So this objective to parlay these guys, to get them in play, and then parlay them a second time with variable problems, like just triple action parlay on the evil Gideon. Like that's a huge action tax. If you have 4 guys, you can be out of here in a couple of turns like I was. If you have 8 guys, because you don't make friends with any of these people, like by definition, you must have made friends with some of them, but maybe Helen, Peters, and Theo aren't on your side. Maybe you save Simeon's life, which means Leia's also alive. And you have 4 more people up here that you need to parlay now. Oh, I guess not Helen. Helen is not actually a resident. But like you can see that like it's a lot harder when you double the length of the act, right? So I have no idea what the average hardness of this act is. I genuinely think it's easier with these guys on the correct side. It's very funny. Like I'd much rather than be aloof and I just spend a move action and they don't exist, rather than spending an action of maybe hitting them so that they won't hit me at the end of the rounds. I also like this Cosmic Emissary a lot now that I've like seen the correct side, because again, earlier in the campaign we established tripping is good. Tripping has value in this campaign. Stuff like the Thing in the Depths is direct foreshadowing of a big boss that you're not allowed to kill where tripping it is the solution. I like Cosmic Emissary, the main one, a lot. I think these guys are kind of chumps, and they're just as chumpy on their other side, although they have a much higher potential to actually hurt you. I think Cosmic Emissary, this one, is an enemy that I actually like quite a lot. But like the act length is wildly variable. It's not a consistent same difficulty act. And that's like part of the huge problem you see in Congress of the Keys. It's also worth noting that when you go down this route, there's no way to interact with the Abyss deck anymore. There's no way to do anything to draw a card from the Abyss other than the Mythos phase, which is, you just get the Mythos card, there's nothing else to do. So while there are other routes that resolve around like the Doctor's route, Route 1, the main route, that is built around getting all your cards out of the Abyss and then killing the entire Abyss deck so that you can actually solve the problem instead of just saving the people of the Vale. But in this route, once you start this act, anything in the Abyss is staying in the Abyss. And like obviously that's not gonna be your character cards, but it means it's just there permanently. And now you have this like weird Abyss rule, but all you ever draw from it is encounter cards and everything else is just a waste of time. And my opinion of the scenario is not that it's an unpolished mess, it's just that the Abyss deck is a massive mental load that doesn't really add anything to the deck, with potential for catastrophically unfun random results in that first act. And then you get to the final map in Route 2 and it's like, oh cool, there's a bunch of text on these cards that seems to be for someone else's version of the scenario. Guess I'll just ignore that shit. And I think ultimately my huge problem with the scenario comes down to this. I've listed a large number of complaints. What do I have good to say about it? Having gone through the encounter deck, I want to say the only thing in the encounter deck that I really like is Crystal Mimic. The rest of them are cards where I either have no opinion or moderately negative opinions of them. Crystal Mimic's the only thing where I look and I'm like, yes, I love this card. This card is perfect. This card's exactly what it should be. I want more of this. Crystal Mimic's fucking terrifying. Not quite mine as dancer tier, but he's a great culmination of all the mechanics you've seen in Hemlock. Because he's so scary, the fact he has elusive allows you to deal with him in a way where you're actually not required to deal with the super scary parts of him. But then he has Hunter, so he'll eventually get back and be scary and likely trigger his forced effect after he attacks you, discard one card at random from your hand when he hunts to your location. His X5X, because his X is the number of cards in your hand, or 6 if you're doing something weird like rifting him, he's very frequently like 5/5/5 or worse, and that's a very beefy, scary enemy to have in a finale. Discarding a card makes that 1/1 look terrifying. There are cards where you just die, basically, if you go down to 0 cards. And he's a great way of incentivizing skill cards because committing a skill reduces your hand size and gives you a bonus, meaning you're lowering his stats in addition to getting the skill value. I think that he's a well-designed, elegant enemy. He's scary as shit and needs to be in only the finale, which is the only place you find him. So I really like this guy. He is easily the highlight of the scenario for me. But the wildly variable final act that I get to have, where like who knows how hard it actually is, these enemies where like you just round them up and run away from them, that's it, right? And you can just walk to the commons, they all teleport there instantly. I didn't notice this initially, that it's even easier to round them up than I thought it was. This guy just needs you to trip him. And like, I just don't have anything I like about the scenario other than Crystal Mimic, which is a damn shame because with a good finale, I think this would have been one of my favorite campaigns. But Fate of the Vale just entirely fails to stick the landing. I have a lot that I dislike and very little that I find good about it. Right now, the lowest ranked finale I have on the list is Congress of the Keys. And this does have similar problems. I think most of the difficulty you face is like weird, obscure mental load that you don't want to think about in the first place. I think that the scenario has wildly different variations where some are tremendously harder and some are tremendously easier in ways that like a finale shouldn't. Because it's one thing to give story resolution and it's another thing to just completely walk over the finale because you did all the correct things. I guess I would describe it this way, right? When I pursue a story path in a campaign, I don't want to have a completely different finale scenario because I pursued a storyline. And I don't want to have like a trivially easy finale because I pursued a storyline. I want a finale that poses like 4 or 5 different difficult problems to me as a player. And then when I like complete a storyline, I would like that to give me a thing in the finale that essentially makes it easy to deal with one of the problems. With Fate of the Vale, instead, like completing storylines can deal with 4 of the problems, as I showed in my scenario resolution. And then additionally, you have like 3 or 4 different scenarios. I would just much rather have one very polished scenario where all the different routes come together to achieve different things in that scenario, as opposed to having the way it works now, where it's just very different. Like, I have to play Fate of the Vale 3 more times to judge the other 3 variations, and they're all gonna rank around right here because they all start with the same fucking Abyss deck shenanigans that's just exhausting and makes the game grind on and isn't fun in any capacity. I think when I sit down to play Congress of the Keys, the scenario takes about half the time to play, and it generally resolves much faster. I think Congress of the Keys is a far more enjoyable scenario than what I just played. I'd rather play Ice and Death Part 2, which is a largely pointless scenario that makes a great map become exhausting to play the 3rd time. It's the part where I feel like Ice and Death has overstayed its welcome. And I still think I'd rather play Ice and Death Part 2, which is just like a tedious grind. I'll rank it above Without a Trace, which I find very frustrating to play. And I'll rank it above puzzle scenarios. Will I? I feel like I'm being too nice to it. Like, the Devourer below just kills you, and the Miskatonic Museum is a walkover for your Kluver and an AFK for your fighter. It's better than that, right? Like, yeah, the Abyss deck makes it grind on, but you're still playing Arkham while it's grinding on. I'm putting it under Fatal Mirage. I think Fatal Mirage is a very good comparison for having a ton of mental load that adds nothing to the scenario and it just takes forever. I think actually Fatal Mirage is a great comparison for Fate of the Vale now that I think about it. And if you've got nothing good to say about it in a list of complaints, you can't in good conscience put it in 5, even though I want to. And I think Fate of the Vale is a big part of the reason why I had such negative memories come back, right? Like, I started getting ready for this campaign by doing a test play of Reddit and Rock to see if I wanted to change my decks. And then the thing I remembered after Reddit and Rock was Fate of the Vale. It's the thing that was freshest in my mind. And like all the good parts of the campaign are like really good. They actually rank quite highly. I love The Longest Night. Lost Sister is very good. Twisted Hollow is very good. Thing in the Depths is like a unique choice that no other scenario is providing you. There are 4 very rock solid scenarios here, and I still like Hemlock House. I don't have strong opinions about Silent Heath, but I don't think it's bad. But then Ridden in Rock is a scenario I see no reason to ever play, and the finale is, in my opinion, the worst finale in all of Akrham Horror. I was rambling for a bit. I'm gonna cut out whenever I feel like I started to go in circles and just say this. Fate of the Vale being such a bad finale for me really breaks my heart with Hemlock Vale. Because if it had stuck the landing, if Fate of the Vale had been even as good as the average scenario in this campaign, which would put it like around Twisted Hollow, Thing in the Depths, high A tier, that would still be like a mid to a slightly above average finale. That would have been a good scenario that I really enjoyed and have a hugely positive opinion of the campaign. But instead, I've just got nothing good to say about fucking Fate of the Vale. It's just the Abyss deck. It just takes forever. It's not fun. Optimizing it is negative fun. I feel like it's perfectly fine for the old god to not show up for the first part of the finale. He can spawn later. That's what the Spider God does. That's what the original, not Azathoth, Yogg-Sothoth does. And Dunwich, right? You don't need the boss to start and play, and I feel like there's just so much going on with the boss spawning and play and then being trivially easy to deal with. And then, it's just the Abyss deck. Every time I try to say anything, it like immediately goes into, and the Abyss deck on top of it all. If it weren't for Preludes and Fate of the Vale, I think I'd have walked out of my first playthrough of Hemlock Vale thinking it was my favorite campaign. Instead, I'm wondering where in the middle it falls because it fails to stick the landing so incredibly hard on Fate of the Vale, and it breaks my heart a little. I still recommend the campaign for anyone just because Longest Night is so good, but like realistically, next time we play this, we're probably gonna be like, all right, now that we're to Fate of the Vale, does anyone want to just play Lost in Time and Space as the finale and Standalone instead? Like, that's where we're at. We've actually already just played the entire campaign on our second playthrough, and then we got to Fate of the Vale, and both of the other players on my table were like, can we just play a different campaign? Like, we can just call it now, right? And I don't disagree. Like, why finish out the campaign if you've been through all the best parts? What's even the point? And it's heartbreaking. It really fucking is. I wish Fate of the Vale were even fine, right? Like, there are so many campaigns with letdowns with their finales. I'm getting used to it, right? Heart of Madness Part 2, Into the Maelstrom, Congress of the Keys. We've been getting steadily worse. The finales have been getting steadily worse. I think that's gonna be it for now. I still cannot overstate that I have a generally positive opinion of Hemlock Vale, despite so much of it being failures in my eyes. I don't think it's the worst campaign. I think there are things in it that are fucking brilliant. And I think of like most recent campaigns hitting this many winners, Longest Night, Lost Sister, Twisted Hollow, and Thing in the Depths, is actually a pretty good achievement. Having 4 of your campaign scenarios land in A tier or above, that's a really good campaign, usually. And considering I only have to play 6, that's 4/6 of the campaign that I'm gonna play are fucking incredible. But Fate of the Vale just shits on it right at the end, and I cannot stand the Abyss deck, man. I just can't. Anyway, that's it for now. I have no way to end this on a non-dour note because that would require me to ignore the finale to end on a positive note, and I just can't do it. If you like the Abyss deck, if you have a more positive opinion of Fate of the Vale, please God, try to convince me to agree with you because I would love to like Fate of the Vale. I would love to like the Abyss deck, but I've got nothing. God, I try to end concisely and I just ramble about the Abyss deck again, don't I? Let's end it for real this time. I've been Rather Incoherent. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate you watching through to the end, what few of you actually do. To anyone who's actually still doing the YouTube dance, liking, commenting, subscribing, all that stuff really does help the channel grow and I greatly appreciate it. And I cannot overstate my gratitude for my supporters on Patreon and my members on YouTube. I'll see all of you in the next one.